Good evening. Good evening to all that are joining us from around the world. I'm Jeffrey Saks of the Agnon House in Jerusalem, joined by my dear teacher and friend, Professor Ruth Wisse. Tonight's program is made possible in part by a gift from the Morris and Beverly Baker Foundation, and we are grateful to them for their support of activities at Beit Agnon. Ruth Wisse has graced us, I think now yearly. We can now call it a long-standing tradition at Beit Agnon that Ruth joins us once a year for a conversation on Zoom. Although, of course, we look forward to the day she'll visit us in Beit Agnon in Jerusalem. And each year we talk about a variety of topics and books and authors and works. In addition to Agnon, of course, over the years in the past we've discussed Saul Bellow, Isaac Bashevis Singer, Chaim Grades, a novel in Ruth's translation, My Quarrel with Hirsch Raciner, most recently A.M. Klein's The Second Scroll. And all of these works, I think, Ruth, you'll agree, have been part of your attempt to resurface the worthy classics of our literary canon, our literary traditions, some of which have fallen off the shelf, and in an attempt to bring them back to our attention. And that's, of course, a great gift, something that you have been doing with distinction in your role these past years as Distinguished Senior Fellow at the Tikva Fund, and, of course, throughout your long career in scholarship and writing, much of which, of course, was spent at Harvard University, where you served as the Martin Peretz Professor of Yiddish Literature and a Professor of Comparative Literature. Before we begin, please forgive me for a brief commercial message. Starting in 3 weeks from today, on January 25th, and apologies, this is really only relevant to those of you in and near Jerusalem. This will not be broadcast on Zoom, but those of you that are close by, and it might be an incentive for those from you far away to join us in Jerusalem, we'll be starting a 5-part series on Sunday mornings, reading short stories from The Outcast and Other Tales. You can find information about that on the Beit Agnon website. And we are very glad to welcome so many of the people that are joining us who will be traveling later this year on our Agnon House tours in Europe, in April to Northern Italy, and in June to Prague, Vienna, and Budapest. Unfortunately, those tours are already mostly sold out, but if you'd like to join the waiting list, or if you'd just like to be added to our newsletter to make sure you find out about future travel opportunities, join us at the link you see on the website or by email. The Gavriel Tirosh Affair, the topic of tonight's conversation, a 1964 novel by the Hebrew author Yitzhak Shalev, which is now soon, in the coming weeks, to be published by our friends at Toby Press in a new translation by Hillel Halkin. I've had the privilege of working with Hillel on translations of Agnon. He's, of course, the premier translator of so much of our classic canon from Yiddish, from Hebrew into English. And now, so many years after its first appearance in Hebrew, to bring this novel to English. It's available on the website of tobypress.com. And for all of you listening, using the discount code Agnon, you can receive a 10% discount on this and on all of the translations of the Agnon library to English, and I believe on their entire catalog, but the book is not yet available. It will be available in the coming weeks as a web page, perhaps, where you can pre-order, but it will be available very, very soon. And of course, Ruth writes the foreword to this new English novel, and as we'll hear momentarily, was the driving force in bringing it to the English audience, because the novel is not known to the English reading audience, because it has not been and is not yet available. And we do not presume that too many of our listeners tonight are familiar with the Hebrew work, or indeed with its author. Ruth and I agreed that I would give a very, very brief synopsis of the novel and a brief introduction to the author, just to situate us. So I apologize for the delay before even turning the microphone over to Ruth, but this is how we thought it would be best to organize the conversation. But I know we're all, of course, here to hear you, Ruth dear, and not me. So I will try to do this with some dispatch. The Hebrew author Yitzhak Shalev, you may be more familiar with his son, the author Meir Shalev, whose many, many novels have been translated and done quite well in English. Meir Shalev, who passed away only, I think, a little less than 3 years ago. So Yitzhak Shalev is the father of Meir Shalev. He's the uncle of the Hebrew author Tzruya Shalev. There was something in the water in that family to produce such literary talent. But Yitzhak Shalev was born here in Eretz Yisrael in 1918. He dies in 1992. He studied at the progressively religious Tachkamoni school in Jerusalem, and then at the legendary Gymnasia Rechavia, the one of really the most premier high schools in the city, in the country, from those days until our own. And in school, he acquired a great love for the study of Tanakh, of the Hebrew Bible. And then later in his life, he taught in the gymnasia, in his alma mater, and in the prestigious high school Tichon Liyada, the high school that's affiliated with the Hebrew University. And in his teaching, he was actually one of the pioneers, if not really the pioneer, of the method of litayel im Tanakh beyad, that one doesn't go out into the field to tour the land of Israel without carrying a Tanakh, a Hebrew Bible, along with you. That was the best way to study Tanakh and to bring it alive. And it's, of course, a method which is still in use today throughout the land of Israel. He was identified very much so with the Israeli right, in time with the movement for Eretz Yisrael Hashlema, Greater Israel. But as an author, and he's most known as an author, he's actually most known as a poet. He authored, I think, well over a dozen volumes of Hebrew poetry, of literary criticism, of essays, less so for his novels. He authored 3 novels, the most famous of which is Gavriel Tirosh. And here's a very brief plot summary of the novel, which we hope you will all read. I've read the Hebrew novel. I've read an advanced copy of the really wonderful translation, and it's a really I wouldn't say it's an easy read, because it's dealing with very heavy subjects, but it's a book which you can really sink your teeth into and make your way through. It reads very clearly. One needs to wrestle with the ideas, but not to wrestle with the prose. It's published in 1964, about 25 to 30 years after the events it describes during the period of the British Mandate in the 1930s. Gavriel Tirosh is a German Jew who arrives in that time after the rise of the Nazi Party in Germany, and he comes and teaches the 11th grade history class in a Jerusalem high school, which we recognize very much as a thinly veiled version of the very gymnasia in which he himself taught and in which he himself had studied. There was, at the time the novel was published, great debate about the degree to which it was a roman à clef, to which it was a thinly veiled historical novel, and is this character meant to be that actual world character? That's a topic which needn't occupy us now. But the high school, I think, is very clearly identified as that very same high school. He arrives from Nazi Germany, but he is a charismatic young teacher compared to the other dry, pedantic, Yekische elder German Jewish teachers, who affix their glasses onto their noses and are as dry as the chalk on which they write on the board. And he, Gavriel Tirosh, believes that unless the Yishuv, the Jewish settlement in the land of Israel, can act to prevent it, the same dangers confronting the Jews of Europe under Hitler would soon be threatening us here in the land of Israel. And with a very kind of strong, militant, activist attempt, he gathers around him a group of his students, a group of his 11th graders, in order to prepare them for the growing threat of Arab attack, which of course arrives during the so-called Me'orot, the events of 1936, with the Arab uprising that took place in that year. And the novel circles around a group of 5 students and this teacher, 5 students, 4 boys and 1 girl, and is narrated by one of these students, a nameless narrator. There's a line, there's a passage which I'll just read, which I think really summarizes what Gavriel is up to. It appears on page 114 of the novel, which you'll all, of course, buy once it becomes available from the publisher. But he's speaking to this group of students, and he says to them, "It's obvious that all the good people in the Zionist executive and the Jewish agency, meaning, in other words, the semi-autonomous Jewish leadership of the Jewish settlement in the land of Israel, it's obvious that all of those leaders are still living the years of their own youth, not of yours," he tells his students. "For them, Jewish heroism means self-defense, whether against pogroms in Russia or Arabs here. You hole up in your stockade and venture out at most on occasional patrol. That's all they're capable of imagining." He's arguing against the policy of havlaga, the policy that was favored by most of the Jewish leadership of restraint, a kind of sense that the British will take care of things and keep us safe, which he, Gavriel Tirosh, identifies as a very galuti, a very diaspora attitude, which has no place here in the land of Israel. He goes on, "Deep down, they're still ghetto Jews warding off anti-Semitic mobs. The possibility of emerging from our barbed wire, striking the enemy in his own territory and forcing him into a ghetto doesn't exist for them. And because it doesn't, they insist we're incapable of it, or else claim, for public consumption anyway, that it's beneath our moral standards. Actually, they would love to give the enemy a taste of his own medicine if only they thought they could do it." And here he's arguing against the kind of lack of imagination, right? Today's Hebrew youth will show them that they can. However, very briefly, and here coming to the end, towards the end of the novel, Aya, the girl of the group, is killed during a nighttime raid in an Arab village. Of course, this is tragic and has terrible consequences for the teacher, who feels the responsibility of having sent her off on this mission and to her death. He resigns his post in the school. He himself joins a military operation from which he does not return. And the narrator, this unnamed narrator, who had been a member of the group, now an adult, telling us the story, narrating the events back from a distance of 25, 30 years later, is trying to make sense of what he had experienced. Even as we discover on the last page of the novel, he's raising his infant son, whose name is Gavriel. That's the very short introduction to Yitzhak Shalev, the author, and to Parashat Gavriel Tirosh, the Gavriel Tirosh Affair. So with that delay, and apologies for it, welcome to Beit Agnon, our friend, our teacher, Ruth Wisse.
Thank you, Jeffrey. Thanks for that summary.
In the introduction, in your foreword to the new novel, you tell, I think, the very interesting story of how you came to this novel and why for many years, I remember hearing about this from you years and years ago. You were the first to draw it to my attention, and that's how I came to read the Hebrew novel. And I remember years ago you telling me how important you feel it is that this has to come out in English. So why don't you just briefly let us in on that story of your relationship with this novel and why you became involved in this effort?
Yeah, well, also in a sense, an apology for the sequence in which we're doing this, because usually what you want to do is to talk about a book that you assume that most people have had access to and have been able to read. And I think that this novel, if I'm not mistaken, was actually taught in high schools in Israel, so that there was a time when many, many people in the country were familiar with it. In any case, as I write in the introduction, I was in the habit of asking students of mine to recommend good novels that they enjoyed and they read. And to tell you the truth, I was particularly at that point looking for novels which would appeal to intelligent teenage readers, because I have grandchildren who are readers, thankfully. And also, we had begun to worry a lot about the education of children here in North America. Even those who go to Jewish day schools and Jewish high schools, what were the books that could excite them? What were the books that could teach them the way we once had learned from literature? When we were young, we looked to literature for our education. You read books because you wanted to find out about things that you couldn't know in any other way. And so in that spirit, I would ask, and one day Yitzhak Shalev, who has written the historical introduction to this novel now, was a student at Harvard, and he told me that he thought that I would enjoy this novel of Parashat Gavriel Tirosh. So I wrote away for it, and that's how I came to it, actually. So why this excited me so much? Well, first of all, because it was exactly the kind of thing I was looking for. A very exciting novel, which happened to be about teenagers. It's not exactly a teenage novel, but it is very much a novel that is about that subject that such novels deal with in great number. Some people call it an initiation novel, but in any case, it's the story of maturation. And it's a story that focuses on the point at which a person learns something, undergoes something so significant that it really changes the course of his life. Now, here's the wonderful thing about this book, which makes it exceptional in that way. The story, as you say, is the story of a narrator who is looking back 20 years after the events that he is describing. Those events took place when he was in high school. I would just make a slight correction. Most of the book takes place in their grade 10, that is to say, their junior year. And then the last chapter, how many years is
the novel, I think, unfolds over the course of about 2 years or so, 2.5 years.
Well, but the novel is, so it's basically before last year, before the senior.
Right, so that's what I said. His 11th grade. Is that you? You're Canadian. I'm American. Yes, so I said here in Israel. Here in Israel, it's 11th grade.
11th grade. Okay, so it'll be the 11th grade, and then the aftermath is the actual senior year, the graduating year of the class. Thank you. So, so what he experiences, though, Jeffrey, is exactly what the Jewish community of Palestine, what the Yishuv experienced. In other words, his maturation, as I see the novel, is exactly the same maturation that the Jewish people has had to undergo. And what excited me about this is that I thought that this was the most important challenge that faces the Jewish people. In fact, it was the most important challenge of Zionism, in the sense that Zionism never foresaw it at all. And when it began to foresee it, it didn't want to see it. So when you have, for example, Theodor Herzl's amazing book of Alt Neuland, you have a book that foresees what the coming to Palestine would be. The one thing that could never happen is a real physical encounter with the people who live in the country. Everyone thought that buying the land, settling the land, coming at it in any way that we could, one way or the other, the Jews would avoid hand-to-hand conflict, would avoid conflict, because however they did it, they intended to do it peacefully with the Arabs. Until this day, you see people saying there has to be a two-state solution, there has to be a comradeship, and so forth. This is more than 2,000 years of exile. This is what sent the Jewish people perhaps into exile to begin with. The political side of Judaism is its soft point. And we know what our record is in political history. And other people know what our record is in political history. And they count on us to be acting in this particular way. So the plot that you have summarized And these good people, what Gavriel Tirosh says to them, these are people who are living in the past. This is true, but this is particularly true for the community of Palestine itself, which was very slow to develop a Haganah, and which was very slow to make that Haganah effective as a fighting unit. So you see, one of the things that so intrigued me here is that the personal story of this young man who matures in the course of the novel is also the story of the Jewish people having to come to terms with the same thing that he has to come to terms with. He is a lovely young man, but he's not made to be a military person. And so when Gavriel Tirosh, the teacher, comes and he starts to form this little group that he wants to become a fighting unit in the country, this person, our narrator, feels you've chosen the wrong guy. I'm not one of these other people that you've chosen for your group who look like natural fighters, like natural, outdoor people, like the natural male hero of this novel. But Gavriel Tirosh assures him, as he assures Aya, the one young woman whom he takes into the group, that this group will need all kinds of talent, that this fighting that he has in mind is not going to need one kind of military person. It's going to have to really reform the thinking of everyone. And so the narrator, you see, becomes the person who tells this story. So in some way, he takes on the subject. So that is, first of all, the thing about this, which is so instructive, that Shalev found a way of telling this very unpopular story, which was not popular at the time. And I must say, I don't think it's become any more popular in our time.
Yeah.
So,
and if anything, it bears the challenge. And I think you mentioned this in passing in your introduction. Today, it bears the challenge of being less popular and far less PC.
Yes, well, it's never been politically correct, but it's not just that. We have to understand how deep this goes. If a people does not want to fight, why should it? And this is true of all democracies. So this novel takes place in about 1936, 1937. The truth is that the same thing is happening in Britain at the time, because it is also a democracy where people don't want to go to war. So they would rather have Chamberlain. They would rather have someone who says, look, we can make peace with Mr. Hitler, we can make peace with this, and so on. People who live in a comfortable way of life and who are used to solving their own problems internally are not looking for confrontation.
Yeah, well, the critiques on Havlaga here, this restraint, parallel arguments about appeasement in England.
Exactly the point. So I think we have to kehave that in mind as a novel of the late 1930s. So this is number one. Then the thing is that, some of the writers that I would have always been enchanted by and instructed by are like people like Lionel Trilling and Norman Podhoretz, for example. Yes, indeed, but very good to talk about him. He wrote a book that takes its title from Lionel Trilling, and he calls it The Bloody Crossroads. And this is from a line of Lionel Trilling's, that they were interested in literature that was written at the bloody roads where literature and politics meet. Mm-hmm. Now, there aren't all that many books in modern Jewish literature that deal with this subject, like a Solzhenitsyn subject or Orwell subject, in quite the same way. This is a book written at the bloody crossroads where literature and politics intersect. And so that is one of the features here. It's a political novel, but it's not exclusively a political novel. And one would like to make that clear. There are lots of people who are wary of this because they think that it really is an advertisement for the Jewish underground that our narrator finally joins, and that Gavriel Tirosh is trying to build in this. But it is a political tract, let's say, that pushes in that direction, well, I would say read the novel and make up your own mind about this. Of course, this is the function of Gavriel Tirosh in the novel. Of course, this is what he has come to teach. And we understand what is pushing him in this direction. Mm-hmm. He also has not come to this just overnight. He is, his sister was killed by Nazi marauders. So he knows what Arab marauders are going to be like. Right?
He comes to his position honestly.
He comes to his position experientially. He has come to this. And so he's come by this honestly. But you see, the novel is written, I would say, on another level as well. And so let's round this out a little bit. So we have the political context of the novel. That's one thing that makes it very strong. And then I'd like to say something a little bit about the historical impact of this novel as well. But it also is a love story. And the love motif here is not, is very intense, because the narrator is a young man, and this is his first love. He falls deeply in love. But the young woman who is in love is not in love with him. She is in love with this teacher. Now that too goes with the historical setting. She's in love with the teacher, but not just with him, but with what he represents and with his kind of strength. And so
she doesn't have the ambivalence that the narrator has.
She does not. She does not have.
She's the truest of believers.
In a sense, this is true, but she's true in it as a woman, and we should come to that, right? Yeah. What is the feature of the woman in here? So you see that woven into this, for one thing, is this conflict between different kinds of personality, different kinds of people. Can a person who is made in one way become a fighter? Should he think of himself as becoming a fighter? And so that is another complicating feature of the novel. One other thing that is very important to me in this novel is that it's historical on a variety of levels. Look, I didn't know. The first time I came to Palestine, for example, to the land, to Palestine / which was then happily already Israel, was in 1959. And very close to the period in which this book was written, not in which it is situated, but in which it is written, in which the last part occurs. Now, that was a time when when Jerusalem was divided. And that is when Mayor Shalev wrote this book. So this book is
Yitzhak Shalev.
Yitzhak Shalev. Sorry, thank you. When Yitzhak Shalev wrote this book, he did not write it after 1967. He did not write it at a time when we think of Israel as we think of it now. He was writing of it in a time when, yes, the state of Israel had been created. He was writing about it at a time 20 years later when it was not yet created. He was talking about this process of transition. But the truth is that he is writing it at a particular point in the history of the Jewish people as well. So there are several historical periods here. This is a period which is situated in the 1930s. We see what the country felt like in the 1930s. Who was living there? What were the generations like? How are kids getting along with their parents? Very difficult, the tension between the younger generation and the older generation, no matter what. Everything was just being information, right? So you get the 1930s, you get what it looked like, the streets, what was happening at that time. But you also, in the book, get the feeling of the 1950s and before 1967, which was a period of, as you see in this novel, great heaviness and mourning in a way. Heaviness. It's interesting. You don't get the triumph of, look, we have our state. It's not 1948, hooray, we've done this. You know that the deed has been done, but you also know the price that has been paid, which is built into, isn't it interesting that this is also built into sort of the fabric of this novel? So I would just like to say that although we have a political novel here that is going in a certain political direction, that is very important for us to take seriously, all of that true, but there are other features in the novel that make it literarily and emotionally much more interesting.
It's often pointed to, the truth is I think that the novel is not well known. At a period it was on the high school curricula, but very few people remember that. I asked a number of my Israeli born and bred friends and neighbors, people who sit in the row behind me and in front of me in synagogue, what their relationship to this novel was. And very many of them didn't know of it. If they knew Yitzhak Shalev, they knew him as a poet. So the poetry was studied and did seem to have more of an impact. But the novel, when it did appear in the 60s, beyond kind of stirring this interest and controversy and gossip about, to what degree, are there historical, actual characters, lurking between the lines? That's just the kind of rechilas, the kind of gossip that people like when, a work of art comes out what then in the 60s was really a very small little literary world in Jerusalem and in Israel. But it marked, and in the literary criticism that followed, it was pointed to as a kind of turning point towards a nostalgia in literature. A nostalgia in literature which represented a kind of nostalgia in society for the era of the British Mandate, which has gone off and on, over the years. Those heady days of imagining state building and imagining achieving something for ourselves before we knew what was coming in full horror during the Shoah.
Well, that's a bit of a bad call, I think. I would say that that's a misunderstanding here, because this is anything but nostalgic. I mean, I understand where that word might come from. In other words, this is a person, the narrator is telling us that he.
Well, by nostalgia, I mean in the authentic sense, like the pain of the nostalgia.
Well, nostalgia means looking back at something. It's memory, I would say. Yes, memory. But I'm not sure that you're longing for that past in the same way that people. Well, you're right in this sense, or those people who said that are right in that sense, that everybody looks back on their youth. People who went through the Shoah as young people will often tell you that was the most intense time of their life. They'll never have a time like that, no matter what they experienced. That was youth. You only have youth once. You don't choose where you have it. And so that's likely to be the most intense part of your life. And that was the most part of Yitzhak Shalev's life. And it was perhaps that youthful thing. So yes, but no, I don't think that he is in any way, certainly not romantic about that period, and very reflective about it. And I think that he is also assessing it in a certain way, because nothing has been defined. In other words, this isn't a book which has really, he tries to end it in a way, making it very concrete how the things are resolved. But the book is really about many things which remain unresolved. And there's a pain of that, of the fact of the lack of resolution.
Well, I jotted a note to myself in the margin towards the end that the narrator seems to be telling us that he has come to resolution, but he is not, in this regard, the most reliable narrator. He claims to have come to terms with things, but I think we, the reader, understand that he has not fully done so.
Well, he is now middle-aged, and he knows that there will never be anything in his life again like what he experienced. He's married. He obviously is married well to a lovely woman. He has 2 children now. But he wanted to name his daughter Aya.
And his wife wouldn't let him.
Well, his wife did not want, for understandable reasons, he says. So, yes, the whole thing is understandable. But that's different from being resolved. In any case, let's see what we can resolve here.
So
yeah.
I'm sorry.
Well, I was going to say maybe one can go through. We have here a book of education, and so that too is very neat. That Gavriel Tirosh comes as a teacher. So the fact that he is instructing us and trying to use this as a means of instructing beyond the class itself comes through in the novel, simply in the way in which he educates this class from chapter to chapter to chapter. So we can look at some of the things. Here comes this young teacher into a class of kids who are just waiting for something fresh in their high school years. We can all recognize that, right?
Yeah.
You just want the teacher who's going to wake you up, who's going to do something new. And so the first thing he does is what you say is Shalev himself developed. And that is, instead of teaching history, instead of teaching it in the classroom, you go out on trips. But look how interesting this is. Gavriel Tirosh takes them out on their first outing. And where does he take them? He takes them to Akko, to the city of Akko. And okay, they're interested in it. But if we notice, he is not taking them to the Jewish sites to show them, here's where Joshua...
He's taking them in the footsteps of the Crusaders.
Yes, but why? He's not taking them in the footsteps of the Crusaders to say, look at how we were overcome. Look at how we were punished here. Look at the way the temple falls. Look at the way the Romans conquered us. No, he teaches them, we look at it from the Crusaders' point of view. And so just to take a passage here, he says, imagine that we are Crusaders. What mattered most to us is the port of Akko. All our supplies and reinforcements pass through it. We have to defend it at all costs. All its approaches must be under our control. One of them is right below us. Now, what do? We build a fortress and a forward observation post right here. And then he takes them through the battle. Now, isn't this brilliant? Gavriel Tirosh, in reformulating them, what he does is change the point of view. We don't want you looking at this any longer from the point of view of those who were conquered here. We want you to see this from the way of those people who came and conquered here. And what would you do in that capacity? You take the uppermost observation point, and you notice how many times when he takes them out, they are always looking for the top point to look down at others. So that is his first class with them. That's only the beginning. I won't go through all the things, but then another thing. So when the kids get the hang of it, at a certain point, you see them beginning to understand that he has singled them out for some important task. And they're not, they're thrilled.
They can't imagine what it's going to be.
They don't know what it's going to be. They're thrilled that they are the ones who've been chosen. So there's something wonderful about that. But only very gradually do they come to understand that he is pushing them against the notion of restraint, that he is pushing them against the accepted ideas of their community, and it makes them quite nervous. And so they get into a conversation with him, and they say, well, look, okay, we have the British who are now in command of Palestine. The Arabs are beginning to fight against the British. Why don't we team up with the Arabs? The two of us will go against the British. Doesn't that make a lot of sense? Because that's what they would like to do, is to have the land together, share the land together. And the British are the ones who are the kind of the foreign occupiers. At which point they say, why don't we, what do we do to defend ourselves against Muhammad's sword? Now that the uprising has come, what do we defend? And Gavriel answers, your mistake lies in the way you phrased that question. The point is not to defend ourselves. It is to attack whenever possible. The fate of this country will be decided by offensive, not defensive action. Right? So this is point number two. And they begin to realize that he thinks differently from the Jewish leadership. And so slowly they begin to understand this, and the book evolves in that. And then finally, by the end, they are being conscripted, and they are being conscripted in the Haganah. And it's only gradually that they, and almost retroactively, that they understand that within the Haganah itself, they are going to have to be the advanced units, and they're going to have to do something a little bit differently. So you see, he as an educator educates through and he takes us step by step through this process, as if to say also to the readers, look, I know where you're coming from. I know how difficult this is for you to understand. You can't do it the way in which you have imagined this coming to pass. It's not going to happen that way. If you are going to do it, you are going to have to become the people who take charge and who are prepared to win.
And part of that point echoes in his repeated reference to the Crusaders, the Romans, the Babylonians, the Ottomans, etc. That to look at history through the perspective of those that came and conquered the land, but each of them were unsuccessful to hold it. I mean, some of them had a good long run, but they were unsuccessful, and so too will be our fate unless we will master the situation and learn how to not just take possession of the land, but to retain it and hold on to it.
Well, Jeffrey, I'm interested to know. I think that's how we feel about it, but that's not that. He doesn't take us to that point. He does not take us beyond the conquest itself. He does not. He just says, he doesn't talk about what you're going to, he doesn't talk about the institutions that we will have to build.
Admittedly, he doesn't do that, but I think that there's
he says you have to win.
Perhaps that was my reading into it, but I think that that's part of what he's saying about those crusaders. I
think he's saying you have to learn to kill, and you have to learn to fight to win, and you have to learn to, I mean, that is his lesson. You see, it's very focused. The book is very focused and short. I mean, the point is, it's not a thesis.
No. I think the English translation runs to something like 200 pages. It's not.
That's right.
It's not the role in literature in general. Forget the fact for a moment this is a particularly charged book at that intersection of the crossroads of blood and politics, and let's add the third layer of education. But in literature in general, in our tradition and in world literature, the character of what we call in Hebrew a charismatur, a charismatic educator, teacher, the eros between teacher and student, which need not be sexual, of course, but the eros between the teacher and student, which here plays out with the high school crush that Aya has on her teacher, but that they all, the other students, the narrator perhaps being excepted, they all kind of have this the admiration that they have. So this is something that we all know, and I think in more recent years we've become a little more sensitive to the abuses of those of that power on the part of teachers and clergy and youth leaders and etc. But this has always been a very, very powerful tool in the author's character that the author can put on the stage. And somebody in the chat, our friend Roz, just pointed out to the prime of Miss Jean Brodie, which was of course first a novel and then a very famous movie with Maggie Smith, which bears a lot of resemblance, because in that movie, as in that novel as well, a student goes off and is killed. And of course, not a novel, but a novelistic film, the Dead Poets Society. There are so many points of parallel. And although I'm sure that all of these authors and creators were working independently of each other, once you start working with a character like this, it leads you to certain points of real danger. So what do you think? Independent of this particular novel, what do you think of this trope in literature and its power and?
You mean of that kind of figure?
This figure of the particularly charismatic teacher and the power, the potential, and also, of course, the danger.
Yes, well, this is not irrelevant to the book, but let me take it in two directions. One is very interesting that, I once, a couple of times I had the wonderful experience of teaching seminars in Israel with Asael Abelman. And he was teaching history and I was teaching literature. And one of the books I taught one year was precisely this, Parshat Gavriel Tirosh. I thought that all the students would know the book, but by that time they did not. So it was very interesting studying it with them. Now, in the class, as we were discussing this, there was one person who was already a teacher. And at the end, the only person who really objected, fought really ferociously, I would say, to the character of Gavriel Tirosh
was the educator.
Was the educator. And she felt that he had misused his authority. Yeah. He had misused his authority, and she felt that the novel didn't work for her in that sense, because she just felt that this was a book at which he should have been punished by the author for having misguided them and for having, and at the end, I think that...
Well, perhaps his death is a form of punishment.
Well, but yes, but the book doesn't punish him. The book just excuses him in a sense, takes him off the curtain, the curtain, as you say. He names his child Gavriel because he wants to honor the image of this person. But this person felt very strongly, as you are suggesting, that there is a way in which, you have used this moment in order to do something which is perhaps a little bit illegitimate. However, at which stage is one going to reform a people? If one wants to reform them, you have to begin at the age of education itself. You have to begin within that process of education. You have to challenge them at that point, and you have to challenge them by capturing them emotionally. And that's why, in a sense, really the literature is what matters. You can't just do this, by edict, and you can't just do this, by. You have to really win their hearts, which is. Which is what
you and I both hope that literature still has that power over the youth.
Exactly.
And so we ask ourselves about it can.
One other point, though, about this, to take it into a slightly different, I don't want to overlook this. See, this is a very, very male book that we've been talking about, because the military, and particularly this aspect of the military, are you going to be able to kill? It's not, are you able to be killed? We know how martyrdom works in the Jewish people. There's no shortage of people who are willing to die for their faith. The question is not that. The question for the Jewish people is, are you willing to kill in order to gain what you must gain? When you know that evil is facing you and you have no choice in defending your community, in defending your land, in defending your rights, but to do this, are you able to bring yourself to do it? So what is the role of women in this? And the novel is quite fantastically interesting. I don't know how many people will be able to really accept this, but it makes a very strong case for what Aya's role is, for what the woman's role is in this. And in a sense, what Shalev brings us here is a kind of mutual protection pact, that the fact that he includes this woman, he doesn't do it arbitrarily. And it's certainly not because he needs affirmative action for women. It's nothing like that. He wants her there because she makes them more gentlemanly, because her presence brings out the protective element in them. Isn't this fascinating? So he includes her, not because he needs a woman, to be there to make the case that women are now fighting alongside men. He needs her there because she is a woman, and because the fact that she comes with them makes them more gentlemanly, makes them aware of flowers, makes them aware of what she's aware of. So they are very, very protective of them. But now here's the point. She is the one who is most protective of them.
Yeah.
Yes, and so
And she's the one who makes the greatest sacrifice.
yes, and that's physically.
Right.
So this is
Right.
so within this, you see, in this change from havlaga to actual, to an actual
Militarism. Yeah.
fighting military people, he is positioning. Uh, he's taking the gender element into account at that very sensitive point of maturation when men and women begin to distinguish themselves and ask themselves the question, what is my role as a woman? What is my role as a man? And he puts it together in this fascinating way that this girl, in her girlishness, in her femininity, brings so much to the to the book, and to the
which we experience through the adult narrators. Here there isn't the nostalgia. The adult narrators, fond memories of his affections for her as a youth. It's a very affecting narrative device because we can feel that we can identify with those loves of our youth and our teenage crushes and things like that. There's another element here in Hebrew literature, in Zionist literature, as in Zionist life and culture and society. There's always the challenge of balancing the story of the nation, the story of the collective, and that of the individual. Great literature is usually told on the plane of the individual, and here there's a kind of balance between the two. The narrator doesn't romanticize the past, but he, as an adult, is still trying to process those experiences of his childhood, of his teenagerhood, of his youth, and to try to figure out what really happened and what really happened to him. And he actually discovers that he, was a very, very small cog in helping to create a Jewish state. This is from the perspective of the early 1960s. But yet there's still this tension that accomplishment, and it was the greatest accomplishment perhaps in the history of the Jewish people, that accomplishment was not necessarily the same as his own personal experience of it. And that tension between the collective and the individual, between the nation and the boy man narrator is where a lot of the interesting part of the novel and maybe of all novels that try to make this balance really does live. Yes. I think, and it's but it's part of it's so much. I see my own son and son-in-law who've recently had their stint in Miluim in the army during these last 2 and a bit terrible years. And thank God they were safe. And I see, friends and neighbors, just on my own block, there are 3 soldiers who we lost from my own neighborhood, and so many others wounded, and this tension of, what we've done as a nation and the awful, terrible, awful price that's paid by individuals, by soldiers, by families, by widows and orphans, and that's where the Jewish story really comes, hits you in the kishkes.
Yes, it's our story, of course, but you have it in Gone with the Wind, and you have it in Tolstoy's War and Peace, and
right.
This is not
and exactly. That's but that these it's not just that, but whenever you have this trying to tell the story on 2 planes, if the author has succeeded, he captures us somewhere in between. And I think Shalev, really has done this here. But we only have a few minutes left, and I don't want to ignore the elephant in the room. As I mentioned, I think you've been interested in this book for a long time, and you brought it to my attention well over a decade ago. And then you told me that you were trying to get it translated and published, and now you have. In a few weeks, it'll be available. And I remind all of our listeners, tobypress.com. You can go and order it. 10% off with the discount code Agnon. And you should all go and read it. And of course, those of you that are capable of reading it in the original Hebrew, the book is still in print, and it can be obtained here quite easily through Amoved, the publisher here in Israel, and in most chain bookstores. but it all means something a little different now after October 7th within your goal of bringing it to the attention of readers in America. So can you say a word about that?
Well, it remains to be seen how it would be received by the individual readers and by the collective. The resistance that Gavriel Tirosh's ideas meet with in this novel are still very, very much alive. Look, this is more painful, as you say. It's painful not only because of what you mentioned, the actual cost of defending Israel against its ongoing enemies, but it's also the ongoing problem. I don't know whether this will ever, whether this can ever be different. The people who say, look, we're going to have to go to war, the people who say we're going to have to be on a war footing, the people who say that we're going to have to do preemptive warfare, are never going to be liked in a society that would rather live at peace. Mm-hmm. So you wish that people could change, that you could change societies, that you could take the militant societies and tell them, look, why don't you develop within yourself the capacity for individual pleasure, for love, for romance, for the kinds of things that you want to luxuriate in? Why don't you develop those capacities? Even as you tell the other societies, why don't you develop the hardness that is required to know that you're going to have to do this from generation to generation? But look, the people who signed the Oslo Accords, were insane. What can I tell you? No people has ever armed its enemy with the expectation of gaining security. That was a suicide pact. And I think Israelis are still reluctant to look back on it that way. They would still like to think, gee, it was worth taking that chance. It was worth doing that. We had to take Yasser Arafat and put him in charge of these people. You see, what else could we do? Well, you see what happens when you do that. The price that you pay 10 years later, 20 years later is 20 times as hard, because you have to face the fact that until others decide to make their peace with you, it's not upon you to impose your peace on them. You see, you cannot will it into being. This is so painful. You see, this is so painful. And that painfulness is something that parents don't want to educate their children to know. Teachers would rather, tell their children differently. We would like to make a different world, you see. We would like to change the world. We've tried, and we would continue to try to make it into a better world. But when that enmity comes against you, and you have to stand against it, then that's what you have to learn. You have to learn that this is part of your moral obligation. It's not immoral. And here's something that one has to learn from this novel as well. There are many people who say, look, if you do that, then you become just like the Nazis. Then you become just like those Arab marauders. And that possibility, by the way, is raised in this novel and is discounted, is totally discounted. No, you do not become like them. You enable them when you don't resist them. But because you resist them does not ever mean that you become like them. There is no such threat. And anyone who tries to make that kind of analogy that then Jews have become the genocidal people, you have to beat that idea back with all your might and all your soul, really. And again, this is why this novel is so fascinating, because it shows you that there is no way that Gavriel Tirosh and these 5 people become their opposite because they engage in this work. Not at all. They stay exactly who they are, but they just do the work that has to be done in order for the rest of the society to survive.
The Gavriel Tirosh Affair, a novel of the 1930s, written and narrated from the 1960s, speaking to us in the 2020s, and making sense of it all is our friend and our teacher, Professor Ruth Wisse, to whom we are very grateful. We look forward to many more years of these annual conversations, with thanks to the Morris and Beverly Baker Foundation for making this and other programming possible. We're going to sign off now and look forward to seeing you all again soon at other Agnon House events, either here in the electronic world or live and in person at Beit Agnon in Yerushalayim. Ruth, thank you so much.
Thank you, Jeffrey. Thank you very much. And thank you for everybody for listening. Thank you.